photos and we do a narration, and perhaps offer our guests your thoughts on these photographs. And we let, okay, so I'm going to put you on speaker. So I'm hoping everyone can hear you. 1 second. Hi, James. So,
hello.
So we left off on the Futura slide, where you were talking about his advancement in his lettering forms.
What? The last slide that we showed was Futura in the Hall of Fame, and I wanted the next one, which is a wall in Barcelona, which is the next slide.
Yes. And in this one, it's interesting because he has, again, his iconography, the diversity in his iconography is really wide on this particular image. We see his atoms and his kind of saw blade image, you know, icons. Tell us about this photograph. Where was it in Barcelona?
This is just a wall in Barcelona. It's an abstract wall, and I don't remember the year of this wall, but it just begins to show us that from the Futura with the little star and the arrow, this is where he's come to. And then, of course, if you had gone to beyond the streets in New York, you would see his wonderful canvases, his sculpture. Down in Wynwood, he's got a wall that's abstract, probably 60 feet by 10. His art is collected all over the world. Really, he is a perfect example of how the art started out very, very simple, not complex at all, and how some of the artists developed style and developed color, and literally the story of from tags to riches became a reality. Next slide.
Folks, if you're just joining us, we're speaking with the legendary Jim PRIGOFF, a photographer, documentarian of murals and graffiti art for the past 30, I would say 35, 36 years, possibly. So we're looking at the Top Cat 126 tag.
Okay, then I want to run through very quickly. At the beginning, this is what I began to see. Now remember that I'm out there looking for murals, and these tags begin to get in my face. And I finally decided, okay, I'll take a few pictures and maybe something will come of it. I had no idea where it was going, but it was street art and it was very visible. This is a Top Cat 126. I think it was up on Amsterdam, about 126th Street, and that's what it says. And that, you notice the long loopy style from Philadelphia.
Yes.
That's where Top Cat came from. And of course, Cornbread was there earlier, and he and Taki were really kind of the icons that get credit for starting the what you might call the cascade of graffiti. Next.
Can I ask you a question? Who were the first writers you met, and when? What year were your first interaction with graffiti writers?
Oh, that's a tough one. I don't know that I can honestly answer that. I do remember Lee. I remember Blast, Blade, many of the New York writers. Here, of course, were the subways that were just loaded with tags. And again, very simple, no calligraphy. This is really the early beginnings of what has come today to be the most important art form of the last 40 years.
So yeah, it was an art form that really was pandemic. Any surface was game. What I like about this photograph of the sanitation truck, and I've never seen this.
I love this photograph because this is the clean team.
Yeah, I've never seen anybody tag on a
really
wheel.
Fixed that one up pretty good. Next.
So this is interesting for me, James. How did you know to take a picture of an intro, or was it just, you know, kind of a random photography shot for you?
It was a random photography, but I suddenly realized that something was happening here. This is an inn, very simple, 2 letters, 95th Street on the west side. Inn claimed to have done 10,000 tags. Now,
Yeah.
I don't question whether he did or he didn't, but I never saw that many of his tags in around New York City, so I can't testify.
Yeah, I can testify to
but,
that.
But
I saw a lot of his work.
He's the most prolific of all.
Yeah, he definitely was. I would vouch.
You can testify to that.
Yeah, yeah, and was
I
very,
most
very
people wrote
prolific.
3 letters, but he was smart. He could get up very quickly with 2 letters.
Now we're here.
These are the early images that I saw back in the late 70s, early 80s in New York City. And then there was Chaka. Chaka was on the West Coast, and he had no calligraphy at all. I used to say to Chaka, get some calligraphy, make your letters look more interesting. When he was arrested, somebody writer said that Chaka has written his name 10,000 times, obviously copying it from the inn commentaries, and Chaka nowhere near ever came back. But there were a lot of Chakas out there, and actually I think when he went up to be tried, he scratched his name in the elevator. Right,
he became kind of a cult figure.
So he was kind of the West Coast name that was pretty prevalent.
Yeah, he made the news a lot.
So this is 1989. Now, remember, in 1985, Henry and I found very little on the West Coast. It really didn't move out of New York City until the middle 80s. And now I want to go back to the very beginning, because what we're looking at here is only a segment of the graffiti history. And that is what I call modern New York history, which then spreads around the world. But there's been graffiti and writing on walls going back. This is the Bull Cave in Lascaux, Altamira. We're talking by minus 17,000. There are now new murals and petroglyphs, hieroglyphs going back as far as 60,000 in Western Australia. So this is part of a long-term movement, but very individual, very creative, and very different than what we've seen in the past. And so if you were to ask me what's coming in the future, I would say to you there are definitely tributaries that will come in the different directions, just as they have in the many years past. Let's look at the next one, because it's a very interesting place I wanted to get to for 30 years. Finally, I was in Lima, and I drove south to Nazca. So this is a hummingbird, if you look closely. It's about a half a mile long. You can only really see it from the air. And these are in the Atacama Desert. And the native people who lived on the west coast, the west side of the Andes, would come out in the desert and scarify and make these giant images. There were hundreds of them. Interestingly enough, there was also a landing strip alongside of many. Now, either they were just simply making these images for the gods, but I suspect that they also thought that people might be coming from outer space, and therefore they would see all of these images, and they created these landing strips. In 1936, they were discovered because they were building the Pan American Highway. So these probably are somewhere around 1,500 to 1,700 years old. People have gone now and cleaned up the top is darker than when you cut it, so you see the lines. But this is only really seen from the air. Is that graffiti? Is that murals? It's all part of what I consider the history. Next.
And so here we have a wall marking.
Oh. This picture I took in 1945. That's my wife, Arlene, and we're outside of Gallup, New Mexico. And the Spanish conquistadors came up, and this is called Inscription Rock. And what did they do? They wrote their names on the rock, and they put a date on them. They wanted to know that people who came after them would know that they had been there. Certainly not far different from all of the graffitis that we know about John Loves Mary and all of the other kinds of graffitis that we've seen throughout the years.
Yes, this is a great slide to be and point to make, because this is in the tradition of a human impulse, right?
Yes. And then we move on to
Los Angeles, the heavens.
I don't know what's coming next.
Well, this,
okay.
Yes.
This is called writing in heaven. Now, how do you write in heaven? Well, you shimmy up the pole on the side, and you write on the over things. You can walk along there. It's very hard to see, but the very left-hand piece is a whisk piece. Now, Whisk is the only person that I know, and he's from L.A., who numbered his pieces. So I think this piece is like 5,000 something, and I suspect that Whisk skipped a few thousand along the way, but nevertheless, he used to write on the buses. He used to write all over. A very prolific guy. And there's a chaka in there. And as I say, it's writing in heaven. So what the L.A. police finally did was they wrapped razor wire around the posts so the kids couldn't get up on top. That's right. That's from L.A. So I didn't have any guides. I just would drive and go back and forth and try to go to places where I thought there would be murals. Then, of course, now we're getting a little more style. Here's Tracy 168 over on the East River Drive in New York City. Quite a difference from the early tags. So things are beginning to get a little more stylized. Probably Faze was probably the first one to do the bubble letters, I suspect. I remember going to one of his shows up on 149th Street, and he certainly had an incredible career as his art developed.
Yeah, may he rest in peace. I have a question for you. At what point did you find that you had a discerning eye for what you were photographing?
Oh, by this point, I'm into it. They've got me by this time, because, you know, the early ones, I remember a T-Kid 170 on a curb, when those were just kind of the early, there was a guy named Ned who I never met in New York City, but he was up all over the place with Bio and Brim. By that time, I was already convinced that there was something happening here, and while I was tracking murals, I began to track graffiti, and after a while, the mural part of it really kind of went to the background, and I really focused on graffiti not only in the United States, but around the world. And I've known, I just mentioned I saw Steam's name. I've known Steam since 1985. He was a friend who guided me through London. Obviously, it was always better. Here's a great revolt up on the Amtrak. It's the only time that I ever came close to getting killed. If you'll notice, the track is pretty close to the wall, and I was there with Sack and Sar, and they yelled, "Amtrak coming!" So there I was over there, so I figured I'd just go against the wall. Well, what I didn't realize, of course, is the train has got wheels on the track, but it hangs over probably some number of inches. It would have crushed me. And they screamed at me, and I think I broke the world's broad jump record, jumped over the tracks and got out of the way. And that's the only uncommon thing that I can report about any danger. And I certainly have been in all of the places where one might might find a little difficulty. I'll tell you a little story about down on Avenue A, Avenue D. I used to go back and forth from Houston up to 14th Street. And I remember one day being there, and I noticed that a number of guys were up on top of the buildings. So it was very obvious to me that there was a drug delivery coming in. And here was a white guy with a camera. No place for me to be. So I moved out. Okay.
Jim, did you ever experience going into a train tunnel or a train yard or a train layup?
Oh, sure. I photographed Freedom's Tunnel very extensively, and in spray can art, one of the very first pieces is Freedom's wonderful piece where he copied all of the different artists.
Right.
So I've been in the tunnels. I've been in the tunnels in Europe. There's a very good tunnel, as a matter of fact, the Dubose Tunnel in San Francisco. I met the cycle in Washington in Underpass. So the answer is absolutely yes. Yeah, I used to go over the barbed wire. I went over the barbed wire once with the kids, and there's a bad-looking dog there, and I don't know how I got back over the wire, but I did get out.
And so now we're looking at a beautiful tea kit.
Okay, here's Tea Kit.
Yeah.
This is from the Hall of Fame. Just wonderful, wonderful early writing. One cute story about the Hall of Fame. Henry and I got a call that we should get to the Hall of Fame on the following day. There was going to be some painting. Little did we know we were being set up so they could come and steal our cameras.
No way.
We knew they didn't get up till noon, so we went at 10 o'clock in the morning, got our photographs, and moved on.
How did you know you were being set up for a robbery?
Huh?
How did you know you were being set up for a robbery?
Oh, someone told us afterward. Oh, yeah, somebody knew. I've never had my camera taken. I've been very fortunate. It's worth $25 for somebody to steal. Pardon?
Knowing the risk involved, both of life and your possessions, why did you?
I guess I don't have fear. I'm thinking about North Philadelphia. Every once in a while, of course, in North Philadelphia, I would go in with a friend, a kid who would take me in there. They wouldn't get out of the car. People would come up to my window thinking I was looking to make a drug buy. I would get out of the car, take my picture quickly. You don't stand around. You don't wait for people to kind of spot you and give them any ideas. And I can't tell you, I've been in literally tens of thousands of places and never had an untoward incident. So I know that that's a potential, but it's never happened to me. I once drove through New York City looking for tags. I drove 600 miles over a weekend, and I came home and I was going to write an article which I was going to title 6 Million Tags and Still Counting. I've been in what you might call pretty much every part of the cities of the country, good and bad, and the graffiti is found not only just in the poor parts of the city, but they're found all over. This is a great cycle. What I'm pointing out here is that I met Cycle in Washington. Then lo and behold, remember in the early days, kids didn't go 4 blocks from their home. They rode on the trains because they could send their name from wherever they were in the Bronx all the way to Canarsie. That was a big deal. But after a while, people began to travel as their style improved. Here's Cycle in, I guess this was in San Francisco, but I met him in Washington. I photographed him in L.A., and of course, he came back to New York City. Wonderful use of the spray can, and very creative. So we see now a real development from those very early tags.
Yeah, and he's just a masterful illustrator, but also conceptually, he is so unique in his themes. This is really quite an unusual theme, and I actually like the variety of texture of wood and metal.
It's stunning. It has a whole 3D sense to it, real dimension. And of course, people like Dime and others began to create the 3D over the years.
Let's go to the next one. Saber's infamous
Okay.
LA Riverbed
So
mural.
Saber, I think it was like 2002. He goes to the LA Wash and he paints with a big roller. This is a classic piece. If you'll notice the length of this, it's 1, 2, 3, almost 4 train cars. A train is 72 feet long, and it took him 1 year. And I think there were about 1,500 gallons of paint. This is not with a spray can, but this is with a roller. And here again, I was told that this was a gang hangout, and that I shouldn't go there with my camera. But I wanted to get this picture, so I did go there for sure. It was later painted out, and I have a picture of, I forget what the writing was over this area. But I think this is one of the classic pictures of all time.
I would say so, and it's a classic piece, but it really set the bar high for how big writers would go in terms of making murals or, you know, any kind of public work. Obviously, this really inspired a whole generation of painters, especially around the concept of scale.
Yes, absolutely. Now, there were a number of interesting pieces in the wash here. I can remember there was a slick and there was a frame, kind of interesting, reflected in the water when the water came down through the wash. This is one of the great moments in graffiti history because this is the battle of Slick and Hex, and this takes place not too far off, I think, the 134, and the idea was that they would paint for 3 days. Actually, they painted with Klieg lights at night, and then I'm trying to remember, I guess it was Fox News aired this in a 20-minute segment. It probably was one of the very first airings of graffiti as art, and we're going back now to the 80s, the late 80s. You can see part of the hex is not being shown, and the slick is not, I can't see it very clearly, but it's got a big train coming out of it, and it's kind of eating up hex. And hex's piece has got a slick coming out of a box.
Yeah, this is a classic production and in terms of the dialogue going back and forth. But I also have to point out the innovation of lighting techniques that they had given us. At that time, no one in New York was painting with the kind of shading in their characters and pieces that these guys were.
Yeah. Hex was a real pioneer, as was Slick. And interestingly enough, Hex came in and out and has reappeared with Fat Cap a few years ago. But Slick, of course, has had an incredible trajectory, and his mural on the side of your wall is just a great mural, and the two hands in the museum are really showing you how graffiti has moved in so many different directions, so many different styles, so much imagination. I just have to hand it to Slick. And by the way, I think, as I remembered, he went to England and he won a graffiti competition there so many years ago. Next. So
the next slide is the art train, the Lee art train whole car.
Okay. Henry gets a call to bring some pen artists out to Detroit. Detroit had a very good idea. They had a train which was probably 6 cars long, and they had a museum inside of the train. The train would then go through Michigan, and the kids would come from the schools, and they would have a show. So this particular show was going to be pop art, and so we've got Wittgenstein, we've got all of the pop artists, Warhol, etc. And so they decided to have the graph artists come and paint. And what we see here is just a marvelous piece by Lee. It almost looks like it's carved out of the train. And a very little piece on the very far right is part of the Billy Blast. But Vulcan was there, and Shai was there, and I did the Shai.
Jim, I did the Shai.
Gandhi was there. Sharp was there. It was a great event.
Yeah. So yeah. just to kind of just add to that, I was there. I designed the Shai whole train, and Futura painted with me and Kel on that whole car. And I have to tell you, with all the great art that was going on, that as excited as I was that we were doing an amazing production, we were burning the whole line. When I went to that little far off corner where Lee was painting and saw this top to bottom, it was just like, okay, I give up. He's got it. The production was so beautiful, so masterful, so well thought out. It didn't need an outline. It was just brilliant. Lee at his best amongst his peers. And what a statement he made with such a simple and beautiful production.
One of the comments I would like to make is that guys like Lee Quinones have stayed humble through all the years, all the adulation they've had, of all the respect that they've earned. They're very remarkable people. And I cite Lee particularly because he's just got great skill. He's created so many wonderful walls and handball courts, but has always been approachable, has always been low-key. Really, I just have great admiration for people like that. Can you imagine this train riding through the countryside? Blow your mind. Absolutely one of the very special historic times, from my point of view, in the history of graffiti.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you, and especially because in terms of the proximity to fine art, where you have such esteemed names like Warhol and Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg on the inside of these trains. On the outside, you have some of the top graffiti artists of that generation.
And many of them who still are in the game.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and who's made a life career out of this, for sure. Okay.
Could you imagine if they kept these trains? I'm
sorry?
Could you imagine if they kept these trains, how important they would be?
Yes. By that time, I had a strong sense of the importance of this. But let me comment that we were pushing Thames and Hudson in 1987, get the book out, because we didn't know what youth might be attracted to in a year or two to come. We did not have a long-term sense of what the trajectory of this art would be. And very few people did. I would say Risk is one of the ones that I've spoken to over the years who knew that it would develop into something very important. But we were just anxious to get the book out because, well, fads come and go, but this wasn't a fad. This connected to literally millions of people all over the world.
So the next slide.
What's coming next?
Yeah.
I'm having fun looking at these myself.
Yeah, these are wonderful. These two portraits, A Hot Day in Harlem. This must have been the Hall of Fame.
One of the things that I endeavored to do along the way was to get to places that I felt were important historically. But this is a complete surprise. I don't know if you've ever seen this. This was at 138th Street up in Harlem, and I come upon this wall, and I say to myself, oh my gosh, this is CMP from Europe. But his style is so identifiable, and of course he's got the CMP in there, but I knew right away that he had come to New York, and here he was painting on 138th Street.
It's a pilgrimage, isn't it? I think a lot of writers come to New York as a pilgrimage, and they still do. They still come to paint the trains, and just for the photograph, just for the fame, the glory. There's something very special about New York in that way.
It needs to be said, of course, that New York was the Mecca, is the Mecca. Most of the writers that I knew came to New York to see the Hall of Fame. I hope that some of your people will take a look at the film Who Was Talkie 183, because that film really has Nasty and Black Claret talking about how they came to New York and they identified that this was something that was happening and it has affected their lives and their work, and of course they became very famous. So people began to travel as they got a few more funds and also as the art form developed. And what comes next?
So you are here in some vacant lot. Where are you in this picture? Is this Los Angeles?
No, this is New York City, 138th Street.
Huh.
I forget which avenue. Oh, here. Oh, okay. That's Steam. Steam maybe even be watching. Steam says to me that there's a water catch out at Ascot. Now, up on the hill is where they have the very famous horse races. People come in very elegant attire, and it's a whole big deal. But somehow down in the forest, there's a water catch. And, of course, when the water fills up a little bit, it reflects the murals. So on the weekends, people would come out from London, and they'd have a box there, maybe some beer, and lower themselves and paint all the walls. This a picture, unfortunately, looks faded here, but it's very clear. There's a big stylo down at the end. And what you did was you lowered yourself on a rope, and then you had to shimmy back up. So here's Steam down below. We couldn't find this place. It took us 3 hours to figure out where it was, but we weren't going to leave without a sense of photographing an interesting place. Nobody bothered them there. They could paint all weekend long without any interruption, and it was a great spot.
So what's interesting, I'm trying to gauge how old you were when you were here. You're an adult, and
okay, I'm now an adult. I'm 92 years old, and so I've been doing this for 50 years. So I was probably in my 40s when I started, and my guess is I was in my mid-50s when I really was seriously photographing graffiti.
next slide is a mural of, I don't know whose mural this is actually.
That's coming up now.
Lumet. This must be Europe.
Oh, okay.
Did you, let me ask you a quick question.
I'm in South Africa. I'm in Cape Town, okay?
Ah, okay.
And I'm driving along, and lo and behold, there's a nice spray can mural. And if you could look closely, there's Lumet and Can 2 from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
These writers now are traveling around the world painting. I get a call from Lumet one day. He says to me, I'm in Los Angeles, Jim. He says, but I can't find any spray can art. This place is just overwhelming. So I said, I happen to be coming down. I'll pick you up and I'll take you around. So I photographed Lumet, of course, in Germany. I photographed him here in Cape Town. There's a Wall of Sin in Chicago where there was a Lumet. And, of course, there was the very famous Hex and Lumet. I think it was on San Jose Street down in L.A. So this is a whole new world of writers who are painting and traveling around the world.
So by this point, a lot of the more advanced painting was probably happening abroad, right?
Yes. Yeah. people were certainly traveling. People were coming from Australia. People were really traveling from everywhere.
So now this next image is a picture of Pez, and I don't know who's other, I guess it's TV Boy and Pez. You turn your attention to street art. How did you kind of decide to photograph street art, kind of not just photograph graffiti?
At the very beginning, as I think I pointed out, I was looking for the political aspect of painting on walls. So many of the artists were not able to get into galleries, and so particularly artists of color went to the walls to paint murals. And as a matter of fact, I would point out that one of the books that I co-authored is Walls of Heritage, Walls of Pride. It's the history of African-American murals in the United States, and there are a number of graffiti artists that I included in that book. It's a great book and one that people should look at. Here I am in Barcelona. I'm on a pleasure trip to Barcelona, but wherever I go, I've got a certain amount of time that I'm going to spend photographing. And this is 6 art, as I recollect it. And of course, Pez, P-E-Z. And Pez has got the green faces with the teeth. And if you're in LA and there's a little character with teeth and just like this one, you'll know that Pez was in LA. So I have a buff monster, as a matter of fact, that I remember from Barcelona. So our writers were really getting around. Barcelona became a major center, and they, like other cities, had an area where factories had operated and then gone south, and the production had moved to other countries, and there were lots of murals being painted there. So I went to a local graffiti store, and I got a hold of the guy who ran it, and I said to him, let's get a bicycle, take me around and show me. So sometimes I had to go and find by myself, and sometimes I would have a friend or an acquaintance who could help take me to the right place.
So let me ask you.
What I should point out
Yes.
is the tremendous variety of style, of how people saw the art, how they comprehended it. I haven't mentioned women, but of course there were few women in the beginning. Lady Pink, obviously, one of the majors. San Francisco, there was a NME, and Shen was down in San Jose. But here's the beginning of, one of the beginnings, I think, of my contact with Shepard Fairey. Here is Obey and some of his posters in LA, and I've photographed, I can't tell you, maybe hundreds of Shepard's work. I once asked Shepard when he came to the city, did he get a crew to go and poster up all of his Obeys? And he said, no, he did most of it himself in the early days. Now, he came out of Rhode Island School of Design. He's a trained artist. He's immensely successful. And he had a whole style that today I have pictures of his 15-story buildings that are just absolutely incredible. He did one here in Sacramento last year. That's just, I would say it's one of a kind. There really is no second Shepard Fairey. So this is a whole other tributary to this big river called Graffiti.
I was just going to ask you about, you've seen this transition, right, from the trains to the walls and name writing to illustration to these murals that are both more animated in one sense and more literal, and this thing that's called street art, right, which is
Well, art, I would say today is called urban art.
Urban art, yeah.
Definitely. And they're major productions, and they are big murals.
Did you feel that the popularity of street art did a disservice to all the graffiti writers, the style writers that were already on the scene for about 3 decades?
I think that there's room for wall. And there's no holding people back from expansion, creation. There was no way to say, look, all you can do is characters and letters. Futura, certainly, again, going back, a great example of abstract. How about John 156?
Yeah.
Just wonderful, wonderful abstract canvases. I saw John down in Miami when he was down there. I know you were with him considerably. I went to his show there. I have John 156s on the West Side Drive. I've got them all over New York City, and I know he finally left New York to go to Paris because he wanted to pursue his art career. So I think there's room for everybody. I think that there's one kind of drawback from my point of view, and that is that the elite art world likes to focus on one or two people because it's a buy and sell, buy low, sell high. And so the Basquets and the Keith Harings, I felt, got more attention and took away from the writers unfairly. But that's the nature of the art world. And it is a continuum. It does not stand still.
The next slide we have is really quite important, actually, because it speaks to our time, Declaration of Immigration.
Okay, so this is a little different form now of art. And I forget, let me see what it says. This is in the Pilsen district in Chicago. And so now we're getting real political messages being put up, some by writers. The amount of political graffiti, it's political by the nature of what it is. But many of the artists are not overly political. But personally, I sought out, of course, and was very interested in a wall like this. Hundreds, literally thousands of people walk by this wall every day.
I'm curious as to why.
So it isn't letters, it isn't characters.
Right.
But it's a form of expression.
I'm curious as to why you chose to have the camel billboard for your slide.
Well, because I want to ask the question. What is the ugliest graffiti of all? Pretty obvious. Billboards. But you and I, we're confronted by them daily. We don't like them. We don't have to see them. But in the commercial capitalist world, this was before they eliminated cigarette advertising. Mr. Smooth character, if you look at his face, it's a phallic face.
Oh, yeah.
You see the young lady in a position that is not normally struck. You see the submarine emerging. It's a very phallic image, very seductive for young people. And when people talk to me about graffiti, I always show these and I say, you know, what's really bad about them is they're up there 24 hours a day because they light them at night. At least graffiti you don't see in the nighttime. So that's why I have that image.
It is.
And another one coming up.
It is true. I would imagine when you were a young man that there was a lot more advertising. That the buildings were painted with so much hand painted signs illustrating marketing.
Yeah.
But that was very interesting because that was a craft. That was a skill. That was a skilled person actually painting the side of the building.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Many of the ads are painted by very capable people, for sure, real artists. In the old days, they used to do most of them painted. Today, of course, they use sheets, printed sheets. But absolutely, that was an art form, a real profession.
And so here we see a bus. The bus wrapped with a Pepsi.
Yeah. Okay. Oh no. Okay. All right. So I call this "Who Gets to Write on the Bus." Not ride, but write. Okay?
Yeah.
Pepsi-Cola gets to write on the bus because they pay for it. But if you're Whisk and you run out and you tag the bus, that's probably 6 months in jail and maybe a $10,000 fine. So notice this is a windows down We're covering the windows top to bottom. Again, the system makes very interesting choices as to who gets to write on the bus.
Oh, absolutely. It's he with the biggest bankroll. So the next image is of a mural on the side of a building.
Let me see. Okay, okay. So one of the nice things about tracking murals is that with new buildings, there has been a 1% for art.
Yes.
So this is a Frank Stella
Yes.
canvas that's 5 by 7. And they have hired these sign painters to paint this huge LA gas company. And I couldn't photograph it from the street because it's just too hard to photograph. So I went next door to the building. And of course, the guard there is there to keep me out. And I say, well, I'd like to go up on top of the building. Could I speak to the manager? And lo and behold, he gets me the manager. And the manager says to me, look, he said, I don't have any insurance. He said, if you fall off the building, he said, I haven't got any insurance. I said to him, I promise not to fall off the building. So I went up on the building. And what's important for a documenter is to capture the art within the artistic setting. I am very unhappy when somebody takes just a piece of the art, which could be anywhere, in a home, in a subway. I wanted to look like it is in the architectural setting. So this is a painted mural in Los Angeles, 1% for art.
I have to say, I'm surprised because I know Frank's work. I've studied Frank for many years. I been very influenced by him. I've never known his work to be put on a mural. This is the first time I've ever seen his work on mural scale.
I know Stella quite well, and I've seen lots of his art. I went to a show of his in Minnesota. He had a lot of art that I had never seen that were very different than the ones that we're so familiar with. So this was obviously a small little canvas. As I say, I think it was 5 by 7 inches, and they blew it up, and it's beautiful.
I will let you know that I've discussed with him the influence of graffiti in his work.
Really?
Yeah. And I've even been in his studio and seen his paint racks of Montana and Belton and Molotov and all that. So he.
I think your listeners should know that you are one of the gems of the history of graffiti.
Well, thank you. I'm amongst my constituents. There's many of us out there, but thank you. But it's interesting because, again, these kinds of things that you bring up are very important for our guests to know, the kind of, how art plays a role in public space and the role we play in it as well, how diversified it is, from the most successful person to the most political person.
Let me add this. I was very anxious over the years to connect graffiti artists with mural painting artists, and I was relatively unsuccessful, although Olivia Goody and Design in Chicago did a couple of murals. But I thought that the graffiti artists could learn from the muralists, and the muralists could learn from the graffiti artists. But I wasn't too successful with that. But I'm showing these images as a hope that they will influence some of the people who are watching and recognizing the tremendous variety and crafts that people do with paintbrushes.
Yeah, and I think the graffiti artists,
whatever they use.
Jim, one of the things I appreciate about doing these talks with the artists and when they reveal their processes and their projects, I am always impressed at how it could be one person like Mad C, and she'll do the whole side of a building without an issue, or or maybe a group of two taking on these big productions. This immense labor that is extraordinary. Whereas usually in these large scale murals that these companies produce, maybe like 3 or 4 people on a project. So this next slide is of the screw and the nut and screw. Or whatever it is.
Okay, we're coming to the end. These are a few slides I always close with. This is part of my early mural history, and this is in Cincinnati, and they were concerned about earthquakes, so they got a bill to retrofit this building. It was much too expensive, so they simply brought in an artist, and as you can see, the artist put a big screw through the building, tightened it up, and there was a very I would say, I forget, about 8 or 10 murals that were created in Cincinnati under a mural program at that time. And of course, today, all over the world, there are mural weeks for spray can artists. I couldn't count how many places and where they all are.
Jim,
they've totally taken over that whole area.
Jim, forgive me. What we're going to do now is pause for a second because we're down to our last minute on Instagram. But I want to everybody stay logged on. We're going to come right back because Instagram will log us all.
Okay, there are only 2 or 3 more pictures, but they're wonderful.
We won't have enough time, but we're going to just stay put. I'm going to log out and come back on. And
I'm staying put.
Okay. We'll be right back, folks, with Jim PRIGOFF.